Good morning, student. Myself, Professor Dhaval Chandarana. I will back of unit number 2, data models, with my fourth video lecture. So, data management system subject we will discuss in my unit number 1, the basic fundamental, as well as we are study some of the basic fundamentals of unit number 2, entity relationship model. Today's topic is we will discuss entity known as a weak entity sets, superclass and subclass, and generalization specialization with help of diagram as well as example. Start with the today's lecture weak entity sets. An entity sets that does not have a primary key is called as weak entity sets. If you do not knowledge about entity and entity sets, please refer my video 1 known as a entity and entity sets of unit number 2. So an entity sets that does not have a primary key known as a weak entity sets. So as per previous defined it, a entity as well as entity relationship. As per diagram, a loan is one of the entity and the payment it is another entity, but a loan have a different attributes known as a loan number and amount. It see that a loan number have a underline, so we can say that loan number is a primary key because we will discuss in my unit number 2 of video lecture 2. Whenever we define some attribute with the underline, it is known as a primary key attributes. In a payment, there are the underline of payment number with a dashed line. It is known as a foreign key of reference of some of the another tables. But in a payment table, or we can say in payment entity, there are no primary key which are seen in your diagram. So payment number, payment date and payment amount, there are the three different attributes of payment entity, but there are the no any primary key attributes in a payment entity. So we can say that which entity does not have any kind of primary key known as a weak entity sets. Relationship between loan and payment with the loan payment relationship set. This will mention a two diamonds. With help of two diamonds, we can identify that it are the strongly dependence with help of loan and payment entities. In my previous lecture, we will discuss that if some of the entity will be strongly depends on some another entity, we can mention a single line. If some of the entity we will partially depend on some another entity, it is decided with the two different lines. So in this diagram, loan have a primary key attributes, that's why we just mention entity with the single square. But in a payment entity, there are no any kind of primary key, so we will mention with the double square, and it is known as a weak entity sets. So in this example, we learn that if we want to mention some weak entity sets in our ER diagram, we need to require a 2 square and mention with the weak entity set. It is defined a strong entity sets whenever we decide to mention some primary key attributes on some of the entity, it's known as a strong entity sets. If the some entity there are no any primary key attributes, it is known as a weak entity set, and it is displayed with the two rectangle. Whenever we mention a relationship set with a two diamond symbol, it is known as a weak entity relationship. And whenever we maintain a strong entity relationship, at that time we just use a single diamond with the two different entity. So in a weak entity set, it is indicated by the double rectangle, which will be explained with the payment. Weak entity relationship set, it is indicated by the double diamonds. It is connection between the loan and payment entity. So I hope you are clear what is weak entity and how it's represented in a ER diagram, and what are the different weak entity sets and how we mention in our ER diagram. So it's a really important thing that whenever we require to display some weak entity or weak entity relationship set, so you just go through these videos. Now the second thing, The existence of weak entity sets depends on some existence of strong entity sets. It previously says that lone number, it is a weak entity attributes. It is mentioned by the dashed line. Means this lone entity will be depends on some another entity. So the discriminations, or we can say primary key or partial key of a weak entity set is the sets of attributes that distinguishes all the entity of weak entity sets. Means whenever we require some unique records with help of primary key, we can easily find out. So whenever we mention some strong entity, there are some primary key, so we can easily find out some unique records. But whenever we require to mention a weak entity and we need to find out the unique records, we take multiple attribute set. With help of combinations of multiple attributes, we can find out our unique record from the weak entity set. The primary key of weak entity set is created by the combinations of primary key of the strong entity sets on which the weak entity sets is existence depends and the weak entity sets discriminator. Means if some of the entity have a primary key, so we can easily find some unique records. But on a weak entity, there are no primary key available. That's why we known as a weak entity. But in a weak entity, we need to find out some unique record, so we can take some combinations of attribute. With help of some combination attribute, we can easily find out some unique records. We underline the discriminator attributes of weak entity sets with a dashed line. We will discuss in a previous PPT. Lone number, it is a dashed line. So as per the requirement, whenever we require some unique record, we can use the combinations of dashed line and some another attributes. A payment entity has a payment number which is discriminator, as we discussed previously. Lone entity has lone number as a primary key. So with help of a primary key known as a lone number and a payment number which is discriminator, and we need to find out some unique record from the lone as well as payment entity. So the primary key of payment is a lone number and payment number. With help of the numbers, we can easily find out some unique records. So I hope you are clear what is weak entity sets and how we can use it. Now we will discuss a superclass versus subclass. It's really core part of any programming language. That's why we need to understand what is a superclass and what is the subclass and how we use in our entity relationship model. A superclass is an entity from which another entity can be derived. That's why we can say it is known as a superclass. Means we can derive some another class from our topmost class. And a subclass is an entity that is derived from another entity. Means whenever we derive some entity from another entity, it is an entity known as a subclass. Means we can take some example like account, it is a generalized known, or we can say generalized entity. That's why we can say it is known as a superclass. Based on account, we can derive two more entity known as a saving account and current account. So we can easily identify that a saving account and current account is derived from the single entity known as a account. So we can say that account is a superclass and saving account and current account, it is known as a subclass. So account known as a superclass and a saving and current account known as a subclass. Example, an entity account has a two subsets known as a saving account and current account. So an account is a superclass because it is a topmost entity from which we can divide to another entity. So it is known as a superclass. Example says a saving account and current account entity are derived from the entity known as account. So as per definition, a subclass is an entity that is derived from another entity. Means so saving account and current account are the subclass of our account entity. We can take another example like we can say a car, it is a superclass, but a petrol car and a diesel car, it is a subclass, because a petrol car and a diesel class, it is derived from the generalized class known as a car. So I hope you are clear what is a subclass, what is superclass, and how we can define in our entity relationship model. So one of the most important point of your unit number 2, as per a practical concept as well as a theory exam point of view, generalization and specialization, it is a really important concept in entity relationship model. So please focus on it. I will mention such generalization and specialization. What are the symbols which specify the generalization and specializations, and how we can use these two important concepts in an entity relationship model. We will just go through with the example. So please be focused on it. A generalization is extract the common features of multiple entity to from a new entity. We can say it's known as a superclass. Like student entity have three different attributes: name, address and SPI. Faculty entity have a three different attributes known as a salary, address and name. So whenever we require to maintain some entity, like extract the common features of multiple entity, like student is a person and faculty also a person, means both entity have some common features known as a persons. To from a new entity means with help of student and faculty, from with two entities we can derive one of the common entity known as a person. So it is known as a generalized concept. Now we will convert our ER diagram with help of generalization features. So whenever we require to convert our entity relation model with help of some features to implement a generalization, we can use one of the key features known as is a symbols. So whenever we found in our diagram is a relationship is available, so it is concept of known as a generalization as well as specialization. So a student and a faculty both are is a person, so we find out some common entities with help of two different entity. It is known as a generalized concept. And person have a name and address, so both the attributes are combined with the student as well as faculty, because student have a particular name as well as student have address. Same thing, faculty have a particular name and with faculty particular address. We can say that a common entity will be matched with the person, and that's why we mention as a generalized concept. What are the specializations? It splits an entity to two from the multiple new entities, thus inherit some features of the splitting entity. In our generalized concept, we combine some entity and generate some single entity. Based on two different entity, we find out some common features. But in a specialization, as per a single entity, we split some another entity. So we can divide our special entity with respect to some different features. So same example we will study in a different manner. A person have a different attributes like SPI, name, address and salary, because person have some different attributes like SPI, it is part of a student entity, and name and address, it is part of a faculty entity. So we can divide our person entity with help of two single entity known as a student and faculty, and we will define SPI attributes in a student entity and salary attributes in a faculty entity. So we remove a single attributes with respect to a particular entity and find out some common attributes with the single person entity. So whenever we split our common attributes with some different entity, it is known as a specialization. And if we have some common attributes with the different entity and we are found some common attributes in a single entity, and we can generate some diagram based on that, we known as a generalization. And if we have some common attributes but we need to split some entity with the unique attributes, so it is known as a specialized concept. So the last point we will discuss that A generalization concept, it is a bottom up approach because we have some different entity and match with the single entity. It is known as a bottom up approach. And whenever we have some unique entity and we split some another two different or more than two entities, it is known as a top down approach. So it is the most important concept of generalization and specialization. Through this we can easily define that the actual ER diagram and the importance of our ER diagram. I hope you are like my videos as well as you are clear about all the things which we'll discuss in these videos. Thank you so much.